My name is Matthew Thompson. I'm the Communications Manager with the Canadian Community Economic Development Network. I'm the one with the mustache there in your top right-hand corner. And it's my pleasure today to be hosting this webinar that will explore what the Global Social Economy Forum is and why you should be there. We hope that many of you will be able to attend. Just to give you a bit of context about the Canadian Community Economic Development Network, we are a nationwide network here in Canada, made up of several hundred community organizations and individuals. They're all working to create local economic opportunities to support an inclusive and sustainable economy. We're located in every province and territory across the country, as well as having membership in other networks such as the New Economy Coalition. We're happy to talk about the Global Social Economy Forum 2016 since we're participating in the Honorary Committee and our long-standing partner with the Chantier de l'Économie Sociale in Quebec. I would be happy to introduce now Mike Sandmelt from the New Economy Coalition.
Thanks, Matthew. Hey, this is Mike from NEC. We, similarly to CCEDNet, are a network of organizations with a really similar mission around building an economy that puts people and planet first, democratic economy, a sustainable economy, connecting community development, community organizing, and trying to build towards a vision for deep systemic change. We've got 158 organizations who we work with in our membership, predominantly across the U.S. A few of them are Canadian. And we just had our Common Bound Conference in Buffalo, which was an incredible gathering of about 1,000 folks doing this work, mostly in the U.S., but had some wonderful participation from around the world. And had Nancy Neamton there from the Chantier telling us a little bit about the Quebec experience. And Nancy reached out to us maybe a year and a half, almost 2 years ago at this point, about the Global Social Economy Forum, and it sounded like an incredible opportunity. I think shaped up to be an incredible opportunity, and we're really hoping that some more folks from the U.S. will consider heading up next month. And so I will introduce Beatrice Alain from the Chantier, who will be leading us in today's conversation.
Hey, I'm Beatrice. I'm both, my regular job is I work at the Chantier de l'Économie Sociale, which is a network of territorial networks and sectoral networks of social economy enterprises and social economy support structures in Quebec. But I'm also, for the last year, have been directing the GSEF, the Global Social Economy Forum 2016. So I'm really pleased to be here and to talk about the forum and a little bit what it means for the social economy in Quebec and more broadly, I hope, outside of our borders.
Great. Thanks, Mike and Beatrice. Just want to point out to everyone, if you have questions at any point during this webinar, please do type them into the chat box, and we'll make sure to take note of them. If we don't answer them right away, we will get to them at the end of the webinar. But jumping right in, so for those of you who don't know French very well, the Chantier de l'Économie Sociale roughly translates to the construction side of the social economy. I was wondering, Beatrice, if you mind explaining what is meant by that.
It would be my pleasure. I have a slide on it. So in Quebec, we actually have a framework legislation that defines this definition. We've used it since '96, but it's really a law now. Social economy enterprises are enterprises and initiatives that create jobs. So there's a consensus that things like volunteering or, say, a women's shelter for battered women, some of the people who work there are actual employees and are paid, even though they don't necessarily sell a good or a service. So there's a broader, that are jobs that are created, even though they may not necessarily sell a good or a service. They're collectively owned, which is really important, we think. and they're democratically controlled, meaning one person, one vote. So in terms of ensuring an equitable share of profits and an equitable control of the activities and the priorities, and an accountability to their users and their communities. They're autonomous from the state, which means that the state doesn't have a say in how they're run. They may, in some cases, receive subsidies or financial grants from a government, but their decision-making is autonomous. And overall, they're favoring people over profits. So there's a priority of promoting or maintaining culture or social cohesion or environmental objectives, etc. So it's a concept that exists, I would say. I would just add, beyond the Quebec border, there are a lot of places that talk sometimes about social economy, sometimes about solidarity economy, for example in Brazil, sometimes about social and solidarity economy. I would say generally in places where speak a Latin language, so French, Spanish, Italian, the term is quite well used. The problem or the challenge is that in English, it's not a term that's very used, even though a lot of practices that are going on, we definitely would consider of the social economy.
So, could you give us a few examples of the kinds of things you're talking about? Yeah,
it helps, I think, to look at things. So things like worker cooperatives obviously want to be well-run businesses because it helps us to be sustainable, but the objective is to, one, create jobs for the members, and also to ensure equitable distribution of the profits. But there's a lot of other things, land trusts that have an objective of, yes, providing housing in the but also long-term preserving affordable housing. Parents-run daycares in Quebec are a very good example. They receive subsidies from the government, but the management of the daycare and the decision-making about what to prioritize, whether cultural activities or outdoor activities, or all of those decisions are made by a board of directors that are parents. And then I just listed a lot of different organizations that work in different kinds of sectors or with different kinds of objectives, but if you notice, they're all collective, democratic, and are not just there to maximize profits.
Thanks, Beatrice. Yeah, I'm sure that many of the people on the call today can relate to some of the examples that you've shown here and are working in some of those models. So the focus of this Global Social Economy Forum is really on what collaboration can exist and how do you create effective collaboration between the social solidarity economy and local government. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways that governments can support social economy organizations, and there's national governments that have their national laws, but in communities, a lot of the basic needs of communities, needs and I think aspirations are often the responsibility of local government. So things like housing, food security, social cohesion, when those needs aren't met, it's very much the city or the neighborhood are the first ones who feel the effect of that. And at the same time, because the jurisdictions of local governments change, there's a lot of different creative ways that local governments have gone around supporting organizations that do things that have multiple effects in the community, i.e. they create jobs and they reinforce social cohesion, or they promote local culture, or they create a meeting point for members of the community. So things like preferential public procurement. In Europe in particular, they have social clauses where governments say, okay, for these kinds of jobs, say renovating a school or maintaining a public space, I only want to deal with enterprises that train workers who are far from the labor market, or who employ handicapped people, or who integrate new immigrants. But there's also things like periodic consultations about the state of the sector, so having a very proactive approach of meeting stakeholders and saying, what do you need in order to develop, create new enterprises, strengthen the ones that are already there, facilitating commercialization, granting land or infrastructure or financing, doing things like encouraging the conversion of private enterprises. So if you think of the law in the U.S. that has a tax credit for people who sell to their workers, that was something that's still very interesting to us in Quebec that we don't have, that we think could reinforce the creation of new worker cooperatives.
That's great, yeah, and I can see how this is taking place across Canada as well. A lot of these, and why it's really important across Canada. I mean, there's areas, much like the U.S. In Canada, that have dealt with chronic poverty or economic decline. I'm thinking, for example, the East Coast in Canada, the Atlantic Coast, with the collapse or the virtual collapse of fisheries, the closing of coal mines, and so on, have left a lot of communities out that side in a struggle to find economic alternatives, and this is a real way that local governments can support the creation of an alternative economy, one that is owned and directed by those within the community itself. We're also seeing this kind of activity taking place in inner city locations across Canada. An example would be in Winnipeg's North End. We have neighborhood renewal corporations that are working with communities to set up food programs, new social enterprises, co-ops. These are important and encouraging steps forward to not just bringing about renewal, but also allowing giving people the opportunity to take on leadership and help themselves out of poverty. Mike, do you see how do you see social economy taking place in the U.S.?
Yeah, thanks, Dustin. And I'm looking through who's on the call, and I'm seeing a bunch of NEC members who are involved in different pieces of this, and it's really exciting. And hey, everybody. Yeah, I mean, in the U.S. context, so we don't use the term social economy often. Sometimes the term solidarity economy gets used. NEC talks about the new economy, which is a slightly broader formulation that incorporates a lot of these things. But in terms of actual policy, I think there's a long history. You could look at the New Deal and the creation of things like rural electric cooperatives. You could look at the employee stock ownership programs that Beatrice was talking about, the Community Reinvestment Act and the creation of the Community Development Finance movement industry, and some really exciting recent stuff that I know some folks on the line have been involved in, whether that's municipal support for worker cooperatives, which we've seen a huge uptick in where I live in New York and in Madison and in California, increasing public interest in community land trusts as a solution, strategy for fighting both blight and gentrification. And I think we're seeing a lot of really exciting social movement energy towards demanding public support for the social economy or the solidarity economy or the new economy, including, I don't know if folks had a chance to look at the Vision for Black Lives, incredible policy document that just came out of the Movement for Black Lives, but includes quite a bit around investing in the social economy, particularly connecting it to demands for racial justice. So it's, I think, a really exciting moment. I think especially given some of the federal gridlock in the U.S., folks looking more and more at how can municipalities and local governments support building structurally different kinds of economies that are designed to serve communities and designed to serve people.
I would say that's true also in Canada and in Quebec, that the last federal government we had was not very receptive, and so there was a lot of focus on the provincial and the local level, certainly. Maybe I'll just skip, should I skip right away to talk a bit about some of the programming? So I think I listed a couple of the examples of what the social economy is, and the kinds of initiatives and the kinds of collaborations that are going on, but there's so many variations of this, and the variations are usually adapted to or reflect the local needs and aspirations of their communities as well as the jurisdictional forms. So it was hard to sort of, when highlighting the programming, what should be put forth, because there's no one celebrity, person or initiative. For example, I was thinking about the case of in Spain. There's two initiatives in particular from Spain. One is Mondragon, which is the largest federation of worker co-ops in the world. A lot of people who work on co-ops would know of it. It certainly had a very important effect in revitalizing the area that it came from in the Basque Country, but it spread much beyond that area and is international and has international operations and is a very sort of successful large model. And then on the other hand, Alencop, which is another case that will be presented during the forum, is cooperatives that are formed of people who were sorting through trash basically and picking up scrap metal. And the city said, okay, structure yourself into a cooperative and we will work with you preferentially in order to ensure that you have decent working conditions, and at the same time you're serving the city, you're providing a service for the city of recycling, recuperating the scrap metal. And actually that's a kind of partnership that exists a lot in Latin America in particular, where the municipalities have recognized the local garbage pickers and organized them a bit, or enabled their organization more, because it's a mutually beneficial relationship. So one very, very local example that's not going to become bigger, but that's certainly an example that can be replicated elsewhere, and one sort of initiative that has gone global in scale. The other kinds of initiatives, I think generally what's interesting about international forums is the comparisons between what's done elsewhere and what can be adapted to our own reality. So for example, there's a workshop that's really going to have a discussion about different countries where they have networks of public officers that work on the social economy. So for example, in France, the network is of people who've been elected at a local level who work on who are interested in the social economy. In Korea as well, in Spain as well, whereas, in France, it's not the people who are elected, it's the bureaucrats, the people who are working on the actual files in their offices, and how do you do it, and how do you have preferential procurement, for example, with a social economy enterprise, how do you find them, etc. So what kinds of networks, how are they built in different countries, and what impact has that had on the sector? And then the other kinds of approaches that is really interesting is territorial approaches. So more broadly, if you think of Cleveland in the U.S., had an approach all around, anchor institutions and how can we drive growth in the community through purchasing more from cooperatives, purchasing locally, et cetera. And that has been has a major impact on that city and has been replicated elsewhere. In Bologna, in Italy, they had a whole approach around the city as a commons, and the government said we want citizens and groups of citizens to propose ways to use the public spaces and public infrastructure, to propose new activities, to manage those activities with us, and it's been a very interesting approach that's also spread elsewhere in Europe. So understanding how those approaches came about and what the effects have been and what parts can be used by us in our own communities to develop parts of those things, I think will be really, really interesting. And then there will be a certain amount of discussions as well taking place on broader issues. So beyond comparing specific initiatives, what are issues that face women managers in the social economy, for example? Or what are different practices of defining, and what are the issues of defining and quantifying the social economy? So if you say that this kind of enterprise is or isn't of the social economy, what does that mean? What kind of impact does that have in terms of their access to financing, recognition by the government, access to public procurement, etc.? Things like open technology, what's the difference between Uber and other platforms that exist that are collaborative but maybe not really shared? Certainly the governance isn't. And what kinds of other practices exist, and what are the issues in terms of facilitating their access by communities? How can communities use more technology, and how can that technology be useful for the communities? So I think a lot of very interesting cases, an opportunity to compare those cases and find out what can be adapted to each of our realities, and then opportunities to have broader discussions, I would say. Sorry, I had another. Just also, there's a lot of other activities taking place around the forum. So things on, on the 6th, there's activities on culture, on research on the social economy, on atypical housing and the use of public, of recuperating large buildings. But there's a lot of site visits as well on the 6th, on the 9th, on the 10th, on the 11th around specific issues, so urban revitalization or artist workshops or et cetera. And I think based on other events that we've done in the past, these are really interesting opportunities to meet obviously the local organizations and see them on where they're working, but also to meet and exchange with other participants from elsewhere who are interested in those same issues.
I was muted, but I think this is where I'm supposed to prompt you to summarize a little bit. What are the high-level objectives of the gathering?
Yeah, I think we want people to really be inspired, to network, and then to leave with tools and plans to make concrete changes. So in terms of being inspired, things like there's a plenary session on the social economy as a strategic tool for the development of cities. So to understand, to sort of have a discussion around what are the needs in terms of cities, what are the challenges faces cities, and how can the social economy contribute to answering them? So how can community-based organizations help local governments meet those needs? And we know that that's the case for so many, housing, for example. The best way to ensure permanently accessible housing for diversity of people is through housing co-ops and land trusts and these kinds of collectives and uses that are owned and managed by the community. Also, there's a networking activity specifically for local government organizations. So to go back and say, here's, in case it wasn't clear or you want more information on what the social economy is, what it can do, because everywhere we find people think they know about one sector but don't realize that the social economy operates in a lot of different sectors. Yes, it alleviates poverty, but there's also the biggest cooperative of video game developers is in Quebec. So there's in all sectors of activities. So what the social economy is and what are the kinds of collaborations that are possible. Did you know that you can do this? Public procurement, support, facilitate commercialization, etc. And then we also think that meeting with people within the same sector with the same kinds of objectives is also really important because they're the ones who are going to exchange the nitty-gritty of how it works and what can it, specific information. So there's a platform specifically that we'll have during the forum in order to identify people with similar interests and meet up one-on-one. So a lot of times, sometimes the presentations get overwhelming and a lot of the interesting conversations happen in the corridor. So it's really to facilitate those conversations in the corridor that make sure that they're with the right people and that good information is exchanged and that there's an ability to follow up on that. And site visits, obviously, the networking activity. And then we hope that this really, the ultimate objective is that this will lead to concrete actions and real change on the terrain. And based on the event that the Chantier organized, a big international forum in 2011, and we really did see both in terms of government action, that it enriched the government action, but a lot in terms of the social economy actors on the ground, that they left with a lot more contacts, contracts, ideas about how to advance their practices, and just exchanges that went forward. And then I think it's always just inspiring to see what's going on and to understand that you're not alone. You're working so hard in your one community, but there's so much other things going on that we can learn from.
That's great. It's such a jam-packed program, and you're right. I think these kind of events are really critical to bringing the local to the global and vice versa. I just want to point out that Veronica Palmer did ask whether there would be any focus at all given to energy alternatives and potentially the deployment of advanced artificial intelligence or advanced robotic systems. I don't know about the latter, but I would imagine for sure there would be focus on energy alternatives at the forum.
Absolutely. Energy alternatives, yes. There's one workshop on, I think, natural resources. There's one workshop on technologies, and there's certainly a working group on the question of technologies more broadly. So, and I think that they really want to touch on both how can the social economy avail itself of technology that's there to work better, so access their members better, but also work more efficiently, but also what kinds of technology is out there that we should be using in our practice, disseminating, etc. So not such a specific I don't think that there will be, say, a workshop on that specific issue, but I think someone able to raise that interest or that sector and show how, for example, that might be interesting for social economy actors to be involved, I think that would be a very interesting contribution in all of those workshops, actually.
Yeah, that's great. And I imagine that a lot of these examples that you've given of both organizational types and social economy focuses kind of hint at who will be at the forum, but I wonder if you could maybe lay that out a little bit more so that people can get excited about who they might be able to meet.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of different kinds of people who will be there, and that's always what's the most enriching to me, really, is that it's a convergence of actors who don't always speak as much as they should. So on the one hand, and I didn't mention that maybe in the introduction, but the difference with, say, the 2011 forum that was organized by the Chantier is that we're co-organizing this with the City of Montreal. Because GSEF comes out of an association that was born in Seoul, South Korea, and the intention of the association was really to enable dialogue between local government and the social economy. So by intention, things are co-organized, co-constructed between government and civil society. And so we benefited from that by being able to mobilize and include a lot more mayors, because we had the City of Montreal and the City of Seoul, South Korea, who were able to invite people. So there's mayors and elected officials from a bunch of different cities, both big and small, so, you know, Addis Ababa and Barcelona and Seoul, but also a lot of smaller cities in Quebec and elsewhere. And then there's a lot of sort of representatives of city administration, so not so much the political, but really the people doing the work, doing the social procurement, managing. In Havana, it's around an initiative to preserve the old historic center from gentrification. So some of them are panelists, some of them are just registered and participating and listening to the discussions. And then overall, if we look at the kinds of participants, the most of them are from the from civil society, social economy, either researchers or you know, enterprise people working in social economy initiatives, and from just really over 50 countries, over 250 cities from all over the place. And to my mind, that's one of the richest things about these events, is that it really, the diversity of people and of points of view really gives a global perspective on certain issues. And at the same time, if we allow for the proper networking, you can both have very specific conversations and very broad conversations that take into account you know, international reality.
So I want to ask a question from the U.S. perspective. I know that there's a lot of pressure on people's time, and this is coming up in just a month, and it requires coming from the U.S. requires going across the border, and for some folks who aren't in the Northeast, going pretty far. And I've personally had some experience with the social economy in Quebec and get why, you know, it's really worth it to come out there and see what's going on, both in terms of the international actors and what's happening locally in Quebec. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit from that perspective.
Yeah, I guess I forgot to say, but in general, talking about who's attending, we're talking about, you know, people from over 50 countries, and we're expecting 2,000 participants in all, so it's quite a large gathering. If I have one gripe about it, is I find that there's not a very strong representation from, or not as strong as it should be, from outside of Quebec and from the U.S., because I think there's so many interesting things that we can exchange, and we're so nearby. And I think that the reality in Quebec is sometimes not as well known, just because of language barriers, and also because the social economy, which is what we would use here, is not terms used elsewhere in North America. But basically, if we look to what's going on here, I think that Quebec is a historically and internationally significant place for the social economy, you know, on an international level. The province of Quebec, for multiple reasons, has a long tradition of collective action, both because the predominance of the church, the minority character of the people living there, and the fact that they were outside of decision-making processes for a long time. The history of network and coalition building in the social economy and also for the social economy, i.e. for the community rather than for individuals, also has a very long tradition. And the result of that is that it's the region in North America which has the least inequality and also the greatest number of social economy enterprises per capita in North America. So I think it's in and of itself an interesting case. It's not the only case in the world, certainly, but there's a very strong presence of the social economy and awareness of that. And one of the reasons for that is the Chantier de l'Économie Sociale, the organization that I work for, is really recognized in Quebec but internationally for its contribution to sort of enabling and building very concretely an ecosystem of support for the social economy through public policy, through the creation of financial tools, through capacity building, so technical training, etc., and through facilitating the identification and transferring of good innovations in one sector and one territory to another. And I think one of the reasons that we've been good at doing that is because we've been committed to international dialogue. We're always learning and listening to what's happening elsewhere in order to see what can be adapted to Quebec. And the City of Montreal, as I mentioned, is one of the other co-organizer. Also has a certain history of openness towards the social economy, certainly co-constructed, meaning they co-developed really with the Chantier de l'Économie Sociale and other networks in each sector an action plan for the social economy on their territory. They have a commissioner for the social economy whose full-time job is to look at and to enable and facilitate the development of social economy enterprises on their territory, and is also playing an increasingly active role internationally in terms of talking about issues that cities face.
That's great. Thanks, Beatrice. I always like the excuse to be able to go to Montreal. And if you're a craft beer lover, it's a great place for craft beer, too.
There's a couple of other attractions, yeah.
I am aware that we are at an hour. We do have just a few other things that we'd like to touch on for those who are able to stay on, but if people do it...
2:30 to 4:30, no? I think we're fast.
Oh, you're right. I'm used to being on the hour, so there you go. We're good to go. Fantastic. And please do keep asking questions in the chat box. I do see a question from Paul Chamberlain asking whether the municipal connection means that there will be examples of social procurement. That's a big thing that's being discussed here in Toronto, and I know it's been on the agenda of a lot of social economy actors.
Yep. I realized, well, the website address is on the slides. It's GSEF2016.org, and don't be scared if you go on there and it's in French. You can just switch the language. Everything is trilingual, so English, French, Spanish. You can switch the language of the website. But you can also look at the detail of all of the workshops here. There's another one that's scheduled that gives you the broader overview. In terms of social procurement, yes, there's several things on social procurement and of cities of different sizes. Again, here it's silly, but there's a terminology thing, because in Europe they talk about social clauses, and that's quite well known, and the EU's given guidelines on that. But if you look at what's happening, say, at the local level in the U.S. around anchor institutions, the idea of that, a lot of that is talking also of social procurement. And then other kinds of practices, say in Montreal, the City of Montreal said they have a space where they have the planetarium and the biodome and stuff, and they said, we would like to have a social economy enterprise providing food services there. And there wasn't one enterprise that had the capacity to deliver, so several of them came together and created a sort of a conglomerate that now serves the food in all of those 4 different institutions that are part of this one giant municipal space. And so it's both the social procurement that's interesting, but also how the city came about asking this, how the social economy enterprises came together to have the capacity to respond, and then what of those elements are useful for other cases, other cities, in Canada and the U.S. and elsewhere. So there's, to more specifically, there's a workshop on social procurement specifically, there's one on commercialization, and there's also one on how the size of cities affects the kinds of programs that they're able and willing to put into place.
Great, thanks, Beatrice. I mean, it's clear that there's a lot of compelling reason for folks to attend the Global Social Economy Forum. But if you were to try to, focus on kind of the main reasons why people would come, what would those reasons be?
I think really networking around action is actions that can be developed, I really believe has an impact. So I think looking to find actors who are doing similar, who have already done similar projects elsewhere, whether it's just creating an enterprise or whether it's developing an innovative practice with their local government, learning how they've done that, how they convinced the government to do so, how the program was set up, what kind of impact it's had, what mistakes they would avoid if they had to do it again. That's really, really important, both for local governments interested in setting up policies that are better for their local community and have more impact, but also obviously for local practitioners. And then oftentimes we find that there's a lot of other things that come out of that, new commercial activities that are developed, either import, export, or duplicating an enterprise elsewhere. Sharing challenges or frustrations and brainstorming around that. And then there's sort of broader issues like, for example, the international agenda. There's a lot of things going on around cities, specifically Habitat 3, but also the UN's, the new Sustainable Development Goals. And there's a UN task force on the social and solidarity economy with 18 different UN agencies, many of which will be there. So it's an opportunity also to ensure that in those action plans, we mention the importance of listening to local communities and taking into account their capacities, their needs. So that means consulting them and adapting programs to not just have one-size-fit-all programs and policies that are for the good of the people but don't actually take the people into account. And then, as I mentioned, I think it's always both a surprise to me and not a surprise, but when you see the breadth of the variety in the initiatives and how some of them have been going on for 20 years and have really demonstrated how viable and how much impact they have in so many different sectors in so many different places, and seeing the amount of people who are committed to making real social, economic, environmental, cultural changes in their communities and have done that. It's always very inspiring and gives you energy to sort of do better, I think, do more.
That's great. Yeah, no, I think this is a really important event for the Canadian Community Economic Development Network on a number of different fronts. I mean, for our members, often the decisions that get made through local governments are the ones that have the greatest impact or the greatest potential to have a positive impact on the work that our members are doing. So, and certainly it's the connections that they have are stronger generally with local governments than with the larger provincial governments and the federal government, which is kind of the role that we tend to play as a network, is bringing that conversation to those broader governmental levels. But for us as well, because we're in the business basically of supporting the development of a broad-based movement that is about making economies that are inclusive, that are more sustainable, that are basically kinder, gentler forms of doing business. It's so important for us to be aware of what is happening around the world. What are examples that we might be able to take back to our home communities or to the policy discussions that we're having with federal governments here. So it's totally invaluable for a network like ours. And Mike, I would imagine it's some similar benefits for members of the New Economy Coalition and for the New Economy Coalition as an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for the sake of time, I'll just sort of echo everything that you've said around the import, and then just add, I think one thing that's been important for us in our work trying to connect folks is that we started NEC 3 years ago. We found that a lot of groups, even doing work in the U.S. on the social economy, weren't necessarily talking to each other, and that there were huge missed opportunities for collaboration, and that we had to check some of our own assumptions there, in that I think there's often a U.S. Bias or U.S. assumption that we're inventing the wheel when in fact we're reinventing it, and when not only is there a lot for us to learn from groups in Canada and in Quebec specifically, but then much of the really innovative and exciting social economy work that is very replicable in the U.S. is actually coming from the Global South. And having an opportunity to do some of that learning and network building right across the U.S. border in Montreal was an opportunity that we thought would be really valuable for a lot of members.
I certainly think that there's, and speaking from, I guess, the Quebec perspective, there's having followed or trying to find out about things happening both in the U.S. and in Canada and outside of Quebec. There's some very interesting things going on, and mostly actually at the local level, and it's sometimes hard to get all the details or to understand something that looks great on a website isn't always so great, or isn't recognized by the community, and conversely things sometimes that aren't on websites and are very hard to get information about have had huge impacts in terms of the development of a community or are watershed moments for what the local governments have done. And so it's really interesting to have the opportunity to meet the people involved, ask the very specific questions, and ask broader questions about where you're going to go from here and what are the priorities now and what are the next steps and how can we maybe work together.
That's great. Beatrice, for those who are interested in going, what is the cost that they would expect?
Yep. So here is the registration fees for now. Not for now. These are the current registration fees. Bear in mind for the U.S. actors that that's Canadian dollars, which I was thinking is peanuts in U.S. dollars, but no, actually the technical amount is around $285 U.S. dollars these days. Bear in mind, because depending on where you're standing on that, it can either be relatively cheap or very expensive, but really a lot of that money is going towards facilitating a diversity of participation. So the bulk is, for example, simultaneous translation into English, French, Spanish, and some travel grants, which means that we're really able to have exceptional discussions between grassroots actors from all over the world and who are not usually able to communicate with each other. I should mention that there's a little bit of money still left for participation grants. I don't have the exact figure on that right now, so I can't say like there are 5 grants going on. Obviously, it depends on where people are coming from and things like, unfortunately, visas and things for elsewhere in the world. For North Americans, that's not really the issue. I would say if anyone listening on this webinar is really interested in coming and not able to pay the registration cost, I would encourage them to submit an application, but to do so very quickly, because otherwise at some point it'll be too late and we'll be using the resources for other people or for other issues, like to facilitate other kinds of networking on spot. And so you can do that by directly clicking onto the link on this slide right now, and that'll open up a form. And in terms of, there's a question about research role and techno role. I think really it's a question of no one's going to ask for accreditation on the spot to see exactly what you're doing. It's a question of sort of an honor code or goodwill. My understanding is that people are paying what they can. So the same thing with a participation grant. If someone's able to pay their way, that's great and that's appreciated because it enables us to bring other people who don't have the means to pay. And if someone is able to pay partially, for example, by representing themselves through the role that they act in their community in a social economy actor, rather than a private organization, because they're not able to do that because they're in their startup phase, then that's also maybe an option.
That's great. Beatrice, is there plans for any kind of follow-up activities as well following the Global Social Economy Forum?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the GSEF comes out of, maybe I'll take a little bit of time because I have it to talk about where it comes from. There's an association that was built that came out of a first meeting in Seoul, South Korea in 2013 that was convened by the mayor of Seoul, who was himself someone from the social economy who eventually got elected, and said it would be great for the grassroots to be talking more with local government. And so they had that first meeting and invited a bunch of people from different countries to talk about their practices. And they all thought that was a very good and useful thing to do. And so they had a second meeting in 2014 and said we should be doing this regularly. And so there was a permanent association called the GSEF created. And the association committed to hosting an event every 2 years. So Montreal, the City of Montreal and the Chantier together proposed the candidacy of Montreal, and Montreal is hosting this edition. So I would say, particularly for the workshops, there'll be notes taken and about the comments and what's working and what can be applicable elsewhere and what can we do to extend these practices. But the working groups as well really are going to try and make recommendations both for the GSEF, in some cases the association. What can the association do to further promote, for example, the social economy within the UN's 2030 agenda? Or in other cases towards GSEF 2016 participants. So what can we all do in order to, for example, strengthen, facilitate young entrepreneurs in the social economy who face particular challenges in terms of access to financing or, technical tools to enable, like, how do you manage a collective enterprise when you're just coming out of university, you may not have that information or things like that. So the idea is to come out with recommendations for different groups that will be participating, and we know that governments will be there, UN agencies, the association, and the broad spectrum of participants who will be there. And I think that there's a very good chance that this will lead to a GSEF 2016 declaration, which will be mostly for the association that is going to work on for the next, what they should be working on for the next 2 years. And that'll be really taking into account the comments garnered from throughout all of the workshops and the discussions. And maybe work about a word on the workshops, because there's so many international forums and conferences going on. I should specify that what's particular about these, I think, and relatively unique, first of all, is the translation. It's the fact that there's simultaneous translation for English, French, and Spanish, so you really get to have a deeper discussion because you can actually speak to people, even if you don't speak their language. But also for a 2-hour workshop, there's usually about 3 presentations. So say on housing, there's an initiative from one country, usually another initiative from a totally different continent, and a third one from a third continent. So that's 20 minutes, 3 times 20 minutes, which is an hour, which sort of sets the stage on the different kinds of practices that answer that one need, and then allow for an hour discussion amongst all of the participants on what else is being done, what should be done to further these practices, how can we share more of this information, etc. So really the objective is to reinforce people's knowledge of practices that are being done, and then have a discussion about what can we do more, how can we move forward from here. So very much action-based. Someone mentioned about the form, which I think the form is trilingual if you look. I'm pretty sure. Yeah. Names, nom, surname, apellido. So.
And then there was a question about the participation of students.
Yep. Yes, there are definitely students. We had some grants that were given out specifically for people 34 and under. And then there's a lower registration rate for people 30 and younger. I think students are definitely interesting and have a very specific point of view in that they're studying a broad range of issues from a sort of a broader perspective, and then also generally the younger generation is very conscious of the limits that we're facing, the economic limits, the environmental limits, and so are very passionate about the priorities that we need to be taking into account in our daily practices, and that's always interesting to have that point of view. I would say in Quebec, I don't know in the U.S., but in Quebec it's the first week of where university starts, so it's a little bit of a challenge to have university students throughout the forum, but they're certainly welcome. Someone asked the question, I think when we were preparing this webinar, about to what extent, are we reaching out to the broad public or to a little bit of a more specific public? And I think, if we're honest, it's really the closest fit is for people who are already working in some capacity in an organization or in an enterprise that is committed to bringing about social, economic, or environmental or cultural change in their community, or works in government and is interested in supporting those kinds of organizations, or as a researcher, or has a financial tool or whatever. So the people working in organizations that are tools that will facilitate those kinds of community-based action. Someone mentioned about the form, that it says that the answers will be given on the week of June 5th. Yeah, we're closing down our grants, but I think it's important to keep an eye open or a handout. I don't know if that's that doesn't sound pejorative in English, but to keep the door open for people who would really be interested and are motivated to come but may need a bit of financial support, without being able to commit exactly to how much we will have, how many of those grants we'll be able to give out. So rest assured that if you submit the form, we have it, but we may not be able to get back to you with a definitive answer right away, because that might have to be no for now. But if in a week we get a bit more funding because more people register or et cetera, well, then we will definitely be reaching out to more people in order to have them come.
That's great. I know that Mike is planning on being there, and some of my colleagues are planning on being there. I'm not sure if I'll be able to attend yet, but Mike Toy, who's the Executive Director of the Canadian CED Network, will be there, as well as Darcy Penner, who's the head of our policy and research coordination in Winnipeg, Manitoba. He co-drafted a social enterprise strategy for the province of Manitoba and will be, I believe, doing some presentations around that. And I know a number of our members are planning on being there. I hope that many of you on the call will be able to join us out there for this meeting. Beatrice, do you have any other items that you wanted to bring up before we close out the webinar today?
No, I guess I hope that we have a strong delegation from the U.S. and from all over Canada at the forum, because I think the opportunities for exchanging on these issues, and a lot of the actual issues that we face, are very similar in North America. If we compare to, we have much more in common than we have in common with what's happening in Africa or in Europe these days, and I think we have a lot that we can learn from each other, and we're so nearby. And so I hope that there's a strong delegation, also because I think we concretely in Quebec have much to learn, but also to speak of in terms of these kinds of practices, both of developing more equitable and sustainable communities, but also in collaborating with local governments in order to do so.
That's great. Thanks, Beatrice, and thanks, Hazel, for offering to help promote the forum. That's really great. We'll be following up with everyone who registered for today's session with a link to the recording of this webinar that you can also share to help promote. And if you do have any other questions, of course, feel free to email the address there on the screen, or email me directly as well. You would have received emails from you leading up to this webinar, so feel free to do that, and I'll make sure to channel those over to Beatrice. And if you have any other questions or would like any other materials to help us to promote, we'd be happy to share that with you Beatrice has included a link there, I see in the chat box as well, to a video that would help as well with promotions.
It's been circulating mostly on social media, but it's also on YouTube, and that's sometimes easier to send to people. But it's just a really short, like 30-second clip on what the forum is exactly and what the objectives are. So that's sometimes useful to clarify what this forum's all about.
That's great, yeah. And Shirley, yes, we will circulate as well the slides that you can use either for reference or for the promotion. That's great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on the call today, and thank you to Mike Sandmel for co-hosting this webinar with us today, and for Beatrice for taking the time to explain what we can expect at the forum, and hopefully we'll get a good North American contingent out there and reverse this trend you're talking about.
I hope so. Thank you. Thanks, Matthew.